Okay, today we're going to learn some vocabulary of sinusoidal functions. So the first thing is a periodic function. All a periodic function is a function whose graph repeats in regular intervals or cycles. So if we're looking at this graph on the board, we can see that it rises up, goes down, crosses the midline, goes back up, and then once it reaches 360 degrees, it starts to repeat, and we see the same shape again. And it will just continue repeating in these regular cycles. The midline, as you can probably guess, is the line that's in the middle of the graph. So it's a line that is halfway between the maximum and the minimum values of a periodic function. So the way that we can determine the midline is by averaging the maximum and the minimum values. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of our maximum y values. So our maximum y value here is 4. We're going to add it to our minimum y value, which in this case is -4. And then we're going to add those together and divide by 2. By averaging the maximum and the minimum value, you can find the middle value that would fall in between the maximum and the minimum, known as the midline. So 4 plus -4 is 0, and if we divide that by 2, 0 divided by anything is still 0. So our midline for this specific function is y is equal to 0. The amplitude is the distance from the midline to either the maximum or minimum value of a periodic function. And it's always expressed as a positive number. It's just the distance between the midline and one of the maximum or minimum. So if we're looking at our drawing here, one way we can determine the amplitude is by subtracting the maximum y value from the y value of the midline. So our maximum y value was 4. We subtract the y value of the midline, which we calculated above, it was 0. Therefore, the amplitude of this graph is 4. You can also just count. If I'm counting from the midline up to the maximum, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 units. The distance between the midline and the maximum is 4 units. You can also count down to the minimum. So if you go from the midline downwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, that should be the distance to the minimum value. Okay. You could also calculate the total distance. So if I go from the maximum to the minimum, that's 8 vertical units apart, and you could take that complete distance and divide it into 2. And so it's 4 above the midline and 4 below the midline. So the amplitude here is 4. Period is the length of the interval of the domain to complete one cycle. So we can see in our graph that it's the distance from maximum to maximum or minimum to minimum. It doesn't really matter which point you choose as long as you're going from one point to the exact same point in the next cycle. So typically we like to use their maximum values. So we're going to take our x2 value, which is 450 degrees. And we're going to subtract our x1 value, which is 90 degrees. And this would give us our period, which in this case, 450 minus 90 is 360 degrees. So what that means is that this graph is going to repeat every 360 degrees. So every 360 degrees, it's going to look like it's repeating. You're going to see the same wave repeating itself every 360 degrees.